Good evening again. I'm David Cook, Senior Planner with Clatsop County Community Development. Thanks for joining us. This is our third virtual public meeting to go over the comprehensive plan updates to 16, 17, and 18. We're sort of nearing the end of the work for the project. In the next following months, we will be moving to the public hearing side of things, where we will be preparing all the work that's been done for this project so far and packaging it into an ordinance form to send out to our Planning Commission and the Board of Commissioners at several public hearings. You guys are obviously welcome to join those meetings as well if you want to stay involved. I think I'll have Gail introduce herself as part of the county, and then we'll move on to our project team.
Hi, I'm Gail Hendrickson. I'm the Community Development Director for the county.
Thank you. And then Garrett, if you'd like to go.
I am Garrett Phillips with Columbia River Estuary Study Task Force.
And Denise.
Yeah, I'm Denise Loffman. I'm also with the Columbia River Estuary Study Task Force.
Great, thanks. And Andrea.
I'm Andrea McLennan. I'm a coastal geomorphologist with Herrera Environmental Consultants.
Thank you. And for those who I haven't called on, I might just go alphabetical order down the list of participants, if that's all right. So there's an Alex von Bergman, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Alex. I'm a natural area manager with the Columbia Land Trust, and I have a few sites I manage in Clatsop County, so just thought I'd listen in.
Great, thanks for coming. And Brett Estes.
Hi there, I'm Brett Estes, and I am the North Coast Regional Representative for the Department of Land, Conservation, and Development.
Great, thank you. And Cameron.
Yep, I'm Cameron LaFollette. I'm the Executive Director of Oregon Coast Alliance, a conservation organization focusing on protection of natural resources of the coast and land use advocacy.
Great, thank you. And Katie.
Hi there. I'm with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm a natural resources climate biologist. It's my 5th day, so I don't quite have that down yet.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. Big title. Okay. Well, thanks for joining. Hopefully this won't be too overwhelming. With the introductions out of the way, Garrett, I'll kick it over to you if you'd like to run the presentation.
All right. Thanks, David. Bear with me for just a moment here.
I'll add one more thing before we get started. Feel free to use the chat function or the raise hand function at any time during the meeting. I'll be keeping an eye on it, and I'll wait for a moment to ping Garrett to pause and take a question.
Yeah, absolutely. Stop me anytime. All right. So can you confirm, David, y'all are just seeing the like a whole screen of slide basically here?
Yeah, we see you, and then I see your face as well.
Great,
I have
thanks.
it set up, but yeah, slides are up.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. We have about an hour and a half, a little bit less, to discuss Clatsop County Comprehensive Plan Goal 16, 17, and 18. And basically thinking about dividing that time roughly in half. We're going to have a little presenting on climate impacts to all of the goals first, but basically going to have some presenting and some discussion, and especially given the group size, just like raise your hand or pop comments into the chat, and we'll stop and answer questions and talk. But we also have a couple of points along the way where we want to stop and potentially ask you questions if we don't fill the time completely otherwise. So again, I'm Garrett Phillips with Columbia River Estuary Study Task Force, and we're assisting the county with this project. And we also have Herrera Environmental Consultants assisting as well. So we began the project back in late 2023 and have been working on draft recommendations and draft policies for the plan update for the last few months after we spent several months just trying to make sure that we had inventoried all of the existing plans and background reports and other information that could inform the plan update. We're planning on publishing the final draft plan documents in January for planning commission hearings that would begin in February of 2025. So for the goal 16 and 17 update, the project scope puts an emphasis on just making sure that we're up to date with basic state goal 16 and 17 requirements, and recommending some policy changes to respond to climate change impacts. Beyond that, the project, we're also going to be recommending some concepts and items to scope into a future Columbia River Estuary Management Plan update, and management plan updates for the other two estuaries. For goal 18, the project has a bit more specific, a few more specific scope items aside from addressing climate change impacts and basic state requirements. And those include recommending policies on non-structural erosion control, cable landings, armoring for public roads, shoreline armoring and erosion prevention for public roads, and incorporating, excuse me, that should be under goal 17, but incorporating public access policies that the county has already spent time working on and has gone through a public involvement process on those. So we had a public meeting in June, another in September, and we just had another one over the weekend a few days ago. And for each of those public meetings that we had, there was also, those were in person. We also had a corresponding virtual online public meeting. And as David said, there'll be public hearings as well, where additional comments are going to be encouraged, and there'll be opportunities to make more changes. We've also had a technical advisory committee that has met 3 times and will be meeting again on Friday morning at 10 a.m. And those meetings are intended for this technical advisory committee group to provide input, but the meetings are open to the public. And the meeting, the Zoom link for the meeting is posted on the county's webpage, where the link was for this meeting. There's also a questionnaire that's online right now, and the link for the questionnaire is also on that same webpage. So before we dive into discussing goal 16, 17, and 18 in more detail, really going to be focusing on the draft policies that we're recommending and sort of running through some highlights from those. Andrea from Herrera Environmental Consultants is going to present on some of the basic concepts that are informing at least the climate change related policy updates. And before we even move on to that, just wanted to check and see if there's any questions about schedule and overall project scope from anybody. All right. Well, with that being said, David, is Andrea set up for presenter view?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay. Andrea, are you set up to present these slides now?
I mean, I am just about to share.
Okay.
Okay, can you
Looks
see
good.
the slides? Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Looks good.
Okay, and I'm just going to shuffle things around. Sorry, the light is never quite right in my office space, unfortunately. It's either too bright or not bright enough. Okay, so thanks for being with us tonight. My name, again, is Andrea McLennan. I'm a coastal geomorphologist. I've been doing this work as a consultant for over 20 years. And our role at Herrera was to support the comp plan by performing spatial mapping and evaluating the coastal hazards, providing a general synthesis of the coastal hazards. We were not conducting new modeling or new analysis. But basically providing that synthesis and summarizing how climate change, coupled with the existing natural hazards in Clatsop County, will impact people, places, and general infrastructure. Our report and map folio are still in development, but will be they're drafted and in the polishing process and will be shared with the greater audience in the coming weeks. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to provide a general overview of the existing coastal hazards, how climate change will be impacting those hazards, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions. So generally, our report is going to touch on or provide a general description of each of the natural hazards found within coastal areas and how they'll be affected by climate change and how that may translate into future impacts on infrastructure within Clatsop County. Many of the hazards that you see here, coastal flooding, riverine flooding, coastal erosion, landslides, earthquakes, and tsunamis will be amplified as a result of climate change and likely occurring with greater frequency and in many cases over an expanded, spatial extent. For example, with sea level rise, we'll see it will result in additional coastal flooding. Riverine flooding will be driven by increases in precipitation caused by climate change. Increases potentially in storm frequency and magnitude will also drive existing coastal erosion hazard areas and may potentially contribute to more frequent or new landslide areas. And then, there's obviously no relationship between earthquakes and climate change, but the additional water levels resulting from sea level rise will expand the impact of tsunami areas. And all of these drivers of change in the hazards and the spatial extent of those hazards will have related impacts on physical habitats and biological communities, as well as risks to human life and property within the county. Our analysis, again, was limited to just coastal areas that are relevant to goals 16, 17, and 18 of the comp plan. As there are other goals within the comp plan that focus on more inland impacts and hazards. So as I mentioned previously, the spatial extent of the existing coastal hazards is and will increase due to climate change, resulting in greater vulnerability and decreasing resilience to those hazards that will increase over time. By effectively planning for the increase in hazards, we can generally increase the overall resilience of Clatsop County's coastal resilience. Now, next I'm going to walk through each of the different natural hazards that we see along the coastline in Clatsop County, beginning with the different components of coastal flooding. Coastal flooding, as many of you are aware, is really just the heightened water levels. And water levels are heightened by many different drivers that you can kind of see here in this graphic. Um, each of these different variables differ across time. So tides obviously vary throughout the day as well as seasonally, with the highest high tides occurring during the spring tide cycle, which, are at their greatest during around the winter solstice. Like, we're pretty much in king tide season now, which I'm sure many of you are aware. On top of those tidal dynamics, you see additional water level coming from storm surges, which are driven by larger scale low pressure systems. They can amplify water levels by up to a meter or up to 3 feet in many places along the coast. Obviously, this is predominantly occurring along the coast. So the impacts of storm surges would have less effects as you move further up river or upstream in the Columbia system. So these low pressure systems are occurring with greater frequency and with greater magnitude over time, potentially in association with climate change. And then you also have, in addition to those storms, you have the impact of waves and wave run-up. And then moving on to El Niños. El Niños are unique in that they can result in, I guess, thermal expansion of the ocean due to the increase in temperature over the northeastern Pacific, leading to kind of elevated water levels for a longer period of time, where you may see up to a foot of additional water level for months or even up to a year. So together, these elements can contribute to enhanced coastal flooding. So when you add sea level rise to the concurrence of each of these drivers, you'll see some of our highest water levels and expanded flooding that is more frequent and more severe. So next, moving on to riverine flooding. Obviously, this is primarily within the Columbia River, as well as the Nicanicum and Ecola Creek. This is largely driven by increases in precipitation, along with it shifts in hydrology associated with our added more flashy hydrography, which is associated with a decrease in the amount of glacier melt and stored water within our water systems, or within the hydrology of those larger river systems, and them becoming more flashy and driven by precipitation. So that changes both the pattern that the flooding occurs, as well as how it occurs or when it occurs throughout the season. Moving on to coastal erosion. Coastal erosion is also driven by a combination of variables, both the occurrence of storms with high water levels and waves results in increases in the total water level. The total water level includes that both wave run up and set up, and that is projected to increase over time, and how our beaches naturally adapt to the rise in total water level is by the whole beach profile adjusting in a process described or referred to as shoreline translation, where the dunes or the upper elevations of the beach and backshore are eroded to help build up the seafloor bed on the lower part of the beach profile. This process is kind of generally depicted in the graphics shown in kind of the center bottom part of the slide. Kind of a snippet from our draft map folio displays the spatial extent of the areas that have been identified as being at risk for additional coastal erosion. I know that the map that you see here is like not at a great scale for you to be able to fully explore, but I want you to be aware that there is, that these maps will be available and this data is all publicly available, and all of those resources will be shared with the report. Here you see a map of existing landslide areas within the county and areas that are susceptible to landslides. Coastal landslides are driven by storms, in some cases earthquakes, largely basal toe erosion, which occurs when waves are run up the beach and are touching or eroding, scouring away at the toe of the bank, resulting in the destabilization, the oversteepening and destabilization of the bank. They can also be driven, or landslides can also be caused by volcanic eruptions and fire, though that's largely outside the scope of what we're trying to look at here today. And they can also be driven by land management. So areas usually that have recently incurred a lot of vegetation removal. It's a common place where you're on coastlines where you will see slides occur. How these areas are exacerbated by climate impacts is by both the increase in precipitation as well as the rise in sea level, resulting in that basal toe erosion occurring at greater elevation, so destabilizing the bluff, as well as over time as sea level rise increases in heightened water levels, or it heightens water levels and increases the frequency of that toe erosion. You'll see more banks eroding that may have been previously stable. Natural hazards. The natural hazards of, like I mentioned earlier, earthquakes are largely unaffected by climate change, but the spatial extent of tsunamis will increase with the rise in sea levels, water levels. Pardon me, I am just tripping all over my words today. Apparently, I'm not that used to speaking in the evening. So within the structure of the comprehensive plan, within the comprehensive plan, just kidding. I mean, obviously that's a little ridiculous of a flub up, but we are looking at these different climate impacts and how they're affecting the different hazards that are found in the different areas that we're focusing on in goals 16, 17, and 18. So goal 16 being primarily focused on the estuaries. We're looking at the kind of migrating salt wedge and how far it's going to be migrating inland, and highlighting the habitats and how they will be shifting further landward. We are writing about how the wetlands will continue to migrate landward and probably shift in the nature of those wetland types, and how salty, brackish, or fresh they are. That gradient will be shifting landward with sea level rise. And we're also highlighting, that levees, dikes, and tide gates, those structures that are controlling sea level rise, controlling saltwater inundation within wetlands may be, they may need to be re-engineered or kind of inspected to assure that they are able to withstand the additional impacts of the additional water level. Within goal 17, within the coastal shorelands, we're looking at, the changes in groundwater flooding, saltwater intrusion in lakes, and how that and other impacts on the water supply that's driving conditions around the lakes, as well as dune migration. Within the Goal 18 area, focused mainly on the beaches and the dunes, we're highlighting areas that will be vulnerable to beach, bluff, and bank erosion, and as well as migrating dunes, dune breaches, and then the implications of shoreline armor and those erosion hazard areas, and obviously the existing regulations associated with shoreline armor. So just a few examples of what each of those impacts associated with the different goals looks like. So here in the Nicanicum estuary, we expect to see more compound flooding. So that's flooding associated with both the river system as well as sea level rise. So kind of those two impacts coming together to expand the nature of the coastal flood hazards within the lower reaches of the river. This might result in increases in bank erosion, as well as lots of shifts in habitats associated with the salt wedge moving further upstream. As I mentioned, or at least tried to describe earlier, and it unfortunately did not do so well at that, there will be heightened and more flashy hydrography within the river system, which could have other impacts on flows and habitats. Moving on to Goal 17, impacts on coastal lakes. We would expect to see more coastal erosion waterward of coastal lakes, potential breaching of the dunes, so potentially forming more tidal connections or open connections to coastal lakes, as well as saltwater intrusion within areas that are more freshwater, shifting to more brackish conditions, which would also bring with it shifts in biotic communities. And there would also be changes in the jurisdictional boundaries between the goals. So as I mentioned earlier, in association with Goal 18, we're going to be looking at we are looking at issues with shoreline armor and dune change, as well as existing shoreline armor, as there's going to be a different set of decisions. Well, there are different sets of decisions associated with how we adapt to climate change in the areas that are permitted to have shoreline armor versus those that are not. So in some cases where they are already armored, they may need to adapt that shoreline armor, like expand the freeboard, which you could see was probably done incrementally over time here in this image on the right, this property in Cannon Beach. Whereas, on the left, where the dune is more intact, they may be looking at adding, beach nourishment material to their dune, or a dynamic revetment, or perhaps relocating structures further landward away from the dune. So they have different set of options available. And that is for good reason, just to remind folks about the impacts of shoreline armor. Shoreline armor, appears to be a great solution to issues associated with coastal erosion. However, in many cases, it's not the ultimate solution. And in fact, it can cause additional issues. It can eliminate sediment input, which sediment input is needed for beaches to be able to translate landward without incurring habitat loss. Shoreline armor can actually increase erosion on beaches by causing waves to reflect off of the vertical structure and entrain more sediment. And you can kind of see that happening here in this image where there's a scour trough waterward of the shoreline armor. The static shoreline armor actually precludes the natural migration of the shoreline further landward, resulting in habitat loss, referred to as the coastal squeeze. then and over time or across larger areas, this can cause a lot of impacts to habitats and actually cause the shoreline to kind of decrease in complexity and shorten. And I guess that's my last slide. So thanks for listening.
Thanks, Andrea. All right, so we have some time now to start talking about the recommended draft goal 16, 17, and 18 policies. And I'm going to dive into doing that. Does anyone have any questions that they want to bring up before we start talking about the draft policies? All right. Well, then dive in over here. So, excuse me, we're trading off presentations, so I had to jump through Andrea's slides. Okay, so in terms of this project and its scope, again, it's goal 16, 17, and 18, and it just applies to areas that are outside of the cities that are in Clatsop County. So again, this just affects areas where Clatsop County has jurisdiction. And it's just about the estuarine resource goal 16, the coastal shorelands goal 17, which is really about lands surrounding the estuaries and land that is amidst and behind the beaches in Clatsop County. And then goal 18, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And both of these goals 16 and 17 are really aiming at protecting and advancing a diverse range of uses that are valued in these environments. And particularly, there's an emphasis on protecting fish and wildlife habitat, protecting public access and public recreation opportunities, and protecting opportunities for unique economic, commercial and industrial uses that really depend on being next to the water, so that those opportunities are not squandered on development that really doesn't need a water location. So thinking about, things like marinas, boat ramps, industrial boat repair facilities, and in some cases in Oregon's larger estuaries, like marine export terminals, import-export terminals. Okay, so in terms of some of the public input we've gotten so far in the meetings that we summarized for you earlier, there's some basic issues that stakeholders in the public have raised with just the usability of Clatsop County's current goal 16 and 17 policies. At present, they come in a almost 500-page document that includes a lot of information that could be more appropriate to include in like a background report. And so even like local government staff, for example, like it's a lot to have a complete understanding of what's in these policies, let alone applicants who are trying to navigate them and understand what they need to do to get permits or to design a project that's consistent with the local policies. So we also heard that there's some policies that feel like they're open to sort of a wide range of interpretations. And so when you get, different staff or planning commissions over the course of 10 years, there's potentially some opportunity for there to be decisions that look different from each other on comparable projects. Since the project scope emphasizes climate change impacts and responding to them, we certainly did get input supporting policies that emphasize resilience and adaptation to climate change. And then there's been a few sort of specific issues and places that have come up in the process we might get to touch on. Overall, we haven't heard that there's any like big problem with the current policies, or that there's some kind of development coming down the road that's that we haven't thought of, or that the current policies aren't addressing. We haven't heard about some kind of major disaster that like we wish we would have updated our policies 10 years ago, but they are getting quite old, over 40 years, I think, for most of them. And there are opportunities to improve. So in terms of usability and sort of regulatory burden challenges, there's a few different areas that we're looking at. One is the list of uses that are permitted either with just a staff review or through a conditional use permit, for example, that requires a planning commission hearing and a quasi judicial process. There's some more particular standards about how certain developments are supposed to occur that we're looking at. And then there's some more process related changes that we're looking at with impact assessments. So we'll run through those here. There's a few uses that appear like they could potentially be subjected to like a less burdensome type of permit review without compromising estuarine resources in terms of habitat, wildlife and fish habitat, public access, and protecting opportunities for water dependent uses. And that includes, for example, the installation of tide gates, active restoration projects, and then in terms of some uses that could also be subjected to a lesser review and not maybe don't have to have a planning commission hearing, but would include written findings and an opportunity for appeal and public notice, would be like navigational structures, aquaculture facilities, and water related commercial and industrial uses. Additionally, there's some standards that seem to appear like repeatedly throughout the almost 500-page Goal 16 and 17 policies, because they follow the state land use planning Goal 16. These findings are required for most uses in the estuary, that a public benefit has to be demonstrated, that the project can't interfere with public trust rights, that alternative upland locations don't exist for a use that's being proposed in the water, and that adverse impacts are minimized. And so this is an example of language that could just be included like once instead of over and over again. And there's other examples too in the policies. And so that's one way that we're planning on just trying to shorten the document to literally make it a little bit easier to get through and to use. And then there's some other examples where policies have changed over the years or practices have changed. So when the county adopted its policies, it was assumed that the local government was responsible for administering compensatory mitigation for estuarine fill projects. And so there's pages and pages of policies specifying how the county is supposed to require compensatory mitigation for impacts to wetlands from fill. And that is actually now a responsibility of the Division of State Lands. So the county's ongoing responsibility will be to ensure that there are some lands protected for that compensatory mitigation to occur in the future. But the Division of State Lands has been and will continue to administer compensatory mitigation requirements. And then for impact assessments are required for most projects that occur in or over the water. And also actually they're supposed to be required for projects in coastal shorelands surrounding estuaries when they could impact the adjacent estuary. One issue we've heard from stakeholders is that the impact assessments tend to require repeating lots of information that's already contained in other permit applications that they're making to the Army Corps of Engineers, for example, or the Division of State Lands for their fill applications, or for a DEQ water quality certification. And so just in an effort to make it clear that as long as the county has all of the information that's required to assess impacts, and that the applicant is synthesizing and making some conclusions about those impacts that are appropriate for the project, they don't have to repeat all of this information again and again, at least in the case of the counties, the impact assessment that the county requires. And so in terms of climate change considerations and policies that respond to climate change impacts, again, looking at use and activity standards, and we'll touch on impact assessments again and resource capability determinations. So this is not required by Goal 16, but if you look at this list of criteria that are typically required for development and alterations in estuaries A through D, those are required by Goal 16. We're talking about adding an additional requirement that would apply that where an applicant needs to demonstrate that the project does not reduce estuarine resources capacity to adapt to climate change impacts. And they would do that through the impact assessment documentation that they do and through the resource capability determinations that we'll touch on in just a moment. But this would be sort of an additional standard that goes along with the others that are required by Goal 16. So Clatsop County's policies and ordinance also specify particular things that need to be included in an impact assessment. And so you would find, if you looked at the policies that are currently there online right now, that an applicant needs to describe aquatic life forms and habitat that are currently present, shoreland life forms and habitat that are present, several other existing conditions. So that's describing existing conditions. Then they describe their project and how it could impact the resources that are in the estuary that they've just discussed. And then they go on to describe how they're gonna avoid and minimize those impacts. And so the idea is that in this initial list of requirements we have here, that in addition to describing some current conditions and current estuarine resources, we'd be requiring consideration of forecasted climate change impacts on the resources that are described, and a description of how the project's impacts will interact with forecasted climate change impacts. And then a description of how the project will enhance or limit the resource's ability to adapt to climate change impacts. And so that's sort of the tie-in back to the standard I highlighted on the prior slide. In areas of the estuary that are designated aquatic conservation or aquatic natural zoning, these are the areas that are supposed to be relatively protected in terms of natural resource protections, as opposed to areas that are designated aquatic development. there's an extra requirement in state goal 16 that a resource capability determination be made for uses and activities in aquatic areas. And so the basic requirement is that the county can make a finding on whether impacts to estuarine resources are not significant, or resources of the area will be able to assimilate the use and activity and sustain themselves into the future, essentially. And so that's the basic goal 16 standard from the state. And then it goes on to differentiate a little bit between the standard for aquatic natural areas and aquatic conservation areas. But what we're talking about doing is adding on an additional standard into this criteria where, again, the capacity of the resources have to be able to adapt to forecasted climate change impacts. And you'd be able to make a finding on this, on whether or not the project will excessively impact resources or will accommodate and allow resources to adapt to climate change impacts using the information that's in the impact assessment. Finally, in terms of recommendations for an estuary management plan update, there's a few key elements of estuary management plans, and one is management unit descriptions. And this is where the estuary is essentially divided up into sub areas that form the basis for zoning of the estuary. And those sub areas are described in terms of their resources, their existing uses and impairments. And oftentimes there's some unique policies that are supposed to guide future management decisions, excuse me, in the sub areas, the management units. And so a recommendation is that in the future, when the estuary management plan is updated, that it also identify climate change impacts and vulnerabilities that are unique to each management unit, and that when management unit boundaries and classifications are revisited through an estuary management plan update, that that part of the project is to make sure that estuary and shoreland classifications are aligned to consider wetland migration, the need for wetland migration, for example, and that in some cases, the boundaries of some management units might need to expand or contract in one direction or another in anticipation of future resource migration. So in terms of places of interest, again, this is more applicable to an estuary management plan update. Just, one of the places that a stakeholder identified was here in the city of Warrenton. Out in front of the city, there's a strip of aquatic area highlighted in light blue that follows the shoreline. And it's highlighted, that the boundary of it is highlighted in light blue here, and the color of it is light blue, but it's designated for like the highest level of resource protection. It's designated aquatic natural in the estuary management plan, and so it's also designated for that resource protection in the city's zoning ordinance. And it it's like sandwiched in between areas that are designated for aquatic development. And so we would anticipate that during a full estuary management plan update that's driven by both the county and the city of Warrenton and the city of Astoria, that a lot of these designations would have to be revisited and discussed in terms of potential changes. And it's possible that there's like a important rationale for that area having that level of resource protection, but that's just an example of a place that would require further discussion. So as part of this process, for updating the county's goal 16 and 17, we are providing updated background and inventory information. Like Andrea said, it's all going to be on a series of PDF maps for the purposes of adoption. But all of the data sources are publicly available on existing web map viewers. And so the goal 16 and 17 policy documents are going to have direct links to those. And the county additionally may be able to consolidate them and host them all on their own web map. But just wanted to give you a sense of where that's going. There will be many pages of PDF map documents that are included. And you'll be able to explore them more using existing online web viewers with links provided to them. So before we go on to goal 18, is there anything that anyone would like to talk about with goal 16 and 17 and what I just went over right there? Hands raised. Okay, nothing in the chat. Right. Well, in that case, feel free to bring anything up as we go along, but I'm going to start presenting on goal 18. So goal 18 is about the beach and dune environment in Clatsop County. And so this plan area extends from the ocean shoreline east to Highway 101. And it places an extra emphasis on public safety and natural hazard mitigation in terms of how beaches and dunes are managed. Places an extra emphasis on maintaining the stability of dunes through vegetation management and policies related to grading. And it also includes the county's policies on where and how erosion control in the beach and dune environment is allowed to occur. Finally, it does include policies on where development itself, like homes, are allowed or not allowed to be built and under what conditions. So in terms of input we've gotten so far, definitely an emphasis on adaptation and resiliency to climate change impacts. And here there's been, some stakeholders have put an even greater emphasis on the idea of resilience and how there's some tension there with stability, for example, right? And Andrea was talking about the shoreline translation process and how resilient dune environments are allowed to move to some extent and translate with changes in the wave environment and sea level, for example. And so that's been an emphasis from the public and generally supportive of the county's efforts to introduce some new policies that are going to be more responsive to the uncertainty that climate change presents. And to the extent that we have some certainty, we know there's going to be some degree of sea level, some new policies that will protect habitats and public access along the shoreline better than the current policies do. So we're looking at doing that through lists of permitted uses, standards, and then what kind of information applicants have to provide in their geologic hazard reports. There's been a lot of discussion about cable landings. So we'll touch on that here. And then, of course, structural and non-structural erosion control methods, and interagency coordination with primarily the Department of Parks and Recreation, which has management responsibility in the ocean shore, which is primarily the beach environment. So in terms of permitted uses, these concepts came from stakeholders who participated in the process. And so we're talking about adding a few permitted uses that currently are just not addressed in Clatsop County's policies. And one is that with the draft policy changes, projects that aim to increase the height of dunes for flood and tsunami risk mitigation would be considered permitted uses. Whereas currently they're not discussed, which could lead to an interpretation that they're not permitted at all, or at least would be subjected to a planning commission quasi-judicial review process with public hearings. And so the idea is that if the county or a community felt like they really wanted to engage in heightening dunes for tsunami and flood risk mitigation, that's the kind of project that should be allowed. And then again, in terms of trying to find ways to encourage less impactful and less permanent methods of erosion control, Andrea was talking about some of the impacts of seawalls and riprap, for example. And we want to, any kind of erosion control can have some impacts. We want to make sure that we're addressing those through a permit review process, but we also want to find ways to encourage people to actually use the less impactful methods. And one way of doing that is to subject them to a less lengthy and uncertain permit review process. So adding non-structural erosion control methods to the list of permitted uses, and then finally ecological restoration projects that are listed or described in a restoration plan from a resource agency, for example. So right now, ecological restoration projects are, again, not listed in the policies as being permitted one way or another at all. And in some cases, they could involve some activities like temporary vegetation removal, or we should really call it vegetation replacement, or grading. And the idea, again, would be to make these kinds of projects permitted uses. State Goal 18 requires local governments to place a preference on less impactful and less permanent erosion control methods. And the goal, and so there's, every local community has this sort of preference hierarchy where applicants are supposed to exhaust less impactful, less permanent, non-structural erosion control methods before they turn to using riprap and seawalls to control erosion. So there's a few ways that public and stakeholder input has informed some changes here. One is just that the existing county list of erosion control methods doesn't include all of the available options. And so we wanted to expand the list and include, for example, in the highest priority position, structure relocation or retreat. In the last meeting this weekend, we also discussed adding structure elevation or re-engineering to the sort of highest preference position. And then more recently, in recent decades, there's been more experimentation with dune with beach nourishment, adding sand to the beach environment for temporary erosion protection, or dynamic revetments, which is adding cobble rocks in a sort of systematic engineered manner to protect properties from erosion. These are less impactful than riprap, which is like large angular boulders that lock together in a more permanent fashion. Dynamic revetments are allowed to move more in the beach and dune environment, and ultimately do allow sediment from behind the dynamic revetment to continue resupplying the beach just over a longer period of time, essentially. And so we wanted to include these in the hierarchy. And then finally, wanted to specify that some of these other methods, like using gabions, which are rocks encased in wire, in a wire structure, very large sandbags and burritos. These are documented to have some unique impacts. They're not as permanent as bulkheads, seawalls, and riprap, but they tend to degrade quickly and leave trash, like the sandbag material itself, all over the beach. So the draft policy puts these in a less preferential position. I think in the interest of time, I'm gonna, actually, I can cover this. Okay, so one aspect of the policies that we're making some changes to is providing authority to require financial guarantees to address impacts that might be, like, we can foresee that they happen sometimes. It's just part of certain kinds of projects. When you build a structure, we can inform a permit decision on that using extensive geological analysis from the applicant, all of the studies that the state has done at the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries. And still there's some degree of uncertainty in the future, right? And the same with erosion control structures like seawalls or riprap, where it's supposed to be designed to a certain specification, but they do deteriorate over time, and that material then can become like scattered on the beach. Similarly with cable landings, we've heard from stakeholders that drilling, and it's been documented that drilling fluids used to drill cable landings underground, that it is relatively normal for them to release drilling fluid accidentally. And that fluid, then comes out into the surface of the beach and dune or coastal shoreland environment. And that sinkholes have also been known to form underneath the drilling route. And so this is another case where some kind of financial guarantee for responding to the issue could be called for. Geologic hazard reports are a really important part of the county's policies when it comes to permitting alterations in the beach and dune area. So the geologic hazard report is prepared by the applicant, and it essentially is how the applicant knows what kind of project, what they need to design their project to in terms of specifications, and it's what allows the county to make an informed decision on whether the project is appropriate for the site. So there's some opportunities were highlighted by stakeholders to make the geologic hazard report requirements more thorough, to address the full range of potential impacts to beach and dune resources, and to consider climate change impacts. So the draft Goal 18 policies are going to include over like 2 pages of new policies identifying geologic hazard report requirements, and they can roughly be broken down into more thorough descriptions of the site itself, the beach in front of the site, where development or erosion control is going to be permitted, for example. More thorough analyses and consideration of erosion and flooding potential in the future, and an evaluation of alternative ways that the applicant can respond to that erosion and flooding under climate change conditions. Finally, a couple of recommended actions. So these are, all of the county's land use planning policy documents are mostly comprised of policies on what can and can't occur in their respective areas, but there's also some actions that are typically recommended for the county to take in the future. And one is just to keep updating Goal 18 in response to new geomorphology data and climate change and sea level rise data that's produced by the state of Oregon. It's been, I think, over or around 20 years since the current Goal 18 has been updated. And hopefully with, an updated document and some updated inventory information, it wouldn't be too hard to revisit Goal 18 again a little bit more frequently, just for some limited updates here and there as needed. And finally, to participate with the Oregon Water Resources Department to more thoroughly forecast the impacts of sea level rise on groundwater resources in the Clatsop Plains. Cable landings have been a special topic for this project. So cable landings are locations and infrastructure where an offshore energy or telecommunications cable comes ashore through the beach and dune and coastal shoreland environment to connect to onshore infrastructure and the cable routes that travel to Portland and other parts of the region. So currently there's one cable landing in Clatsop County that actually goes through, it lands in the city of Warrenton at DeLaura Beach Road. That was done, I think, around 10 years ago. And so there's a cable that comes from a telecommunications cable that connects to Alaska, and it lands there at DeLaura Beach Road and travels underground and comes up to the surface at a building at DeLaura Beach Road and Oak Lane in the dune shoreland residential environment that's back there behind the beach. And it comes up into a building that's been made to look a bit like a house. But it's, the property's surrounded by a chain link fence. And so it'd be interesting to know if any of y'all are familiar with that site, or if you're familiar with any issues that happened there when that cable landing occurred. But more recently, there's been some cable landing projects in Tillamook County and other places in Oregon where there was some significant impacts and you could say accidents and issues that occurred with those. And so that's one of the reasons that Clatsop County wants to create some policies to be ready to respond to a cable landing proposal. And so we've talked about the potential impacts of cable landings at relative length in prior meetings. And we've drafted some policies that include draft prohibition areas, and that also discuss how permit applications are supposed to be considered. And so one of the requirements would be that all components of the cable landing project have to be considered comprehensively through a conditional use permit process. So you couldn't come in and get approval for just the manhole and the beach cable location before considering the rest of the route that's going to travel through the area going all the way to Highway 101. Like that whole route between the ocean and the highway has to be considered, and the whole project has to be considered comprehensively. Cable landings sites, once they're approved, tend to attract more cable. And so the idea is that the application has to be specific about the intended maximum built out condition. And then that's fine if somebody wants to apply to expand it, but that would require an additional sort of comprehensive review of what's being proposed independently at a later date. And then another recommended policy is requiring a pre-application conference with several coordinating state agencies. And each of the state agencies listed here, Department of Transportation, State Lands, Parks and Recreation, and DLCD, have a role in some aspect of permitting a cable landing project. And they all have a role in considering some of the impacts that local communities are concerned about when it comes to impacts to transportation networks, beaches and dunes, and shoreland habitats. So pre-application conference required, and then also just coordination throughout the permit process, with opportunities for those state agencies to weigh in on the local permit and affect the local permit decision. And then just a requirement that that when reviewing the application, that both the temporary construction impacts and post-construction impacts are considered, and that the projects have contingency plans for when sinkholes are created and when there's inadvertent releases of drilling fluids. And so those contingency plans are part of like industry best practice, and there's even guidance from the federal government on what's supposed to be included in those. And the county, the county could create 20 pages describing what's supposed to 20 pages of policies describing what's supposed to be in them. And we're not proposing to do that. We're just proposing to say that they have to have these plans. And then in terms of the specifications for what's in them, that can be addressed through pre-application conferences and recommended conditions of approval in a conditional use permit. So in terms of the topic of erosion control and erosion mitigation, again, there's expanded geologic hazard report requirements that are really intended to capture a lot of the opportunities for improving the process here. Again, adding a preference for relocation, structure relocation, re-engineering, elevation of structures potentially, in terms of alternatives that need to be exhausted or deemed infeasible before using more impactful methods. And finally, because the county's going to be, the recommendation is for the county to adopt Dogami's most updated geomorphology data for the beach and dune environment, that there will be a better current information that applicants have to refer to, and that staff or the planning commission have available to inform their decisions going forward. In terms of interagency coordination, there's some new policies that emphasize more coordination with Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. Those include requiring foredune grading plans to be consistent with the state ocean shore management plan. And the rationale for that is that ultimately, if anyone wanted to do any kind of beach or dune grading under a foredune management plan, they have to get permits from the Oregon Department of Parks and Recreation also. And if the overall comprehensive grading plan isn't consistent with the state standards, then it's basically useless to any homeowners association or applicant that wanted to do grading under the foredune grading plan. Already discussed a couple of draft policies that enhance coordination on cable landings. The county already has a policy to coordinate actions with OPRD in the ocean shore, and they do that. There's not like an identified problem with their coordination so far, but cable landings seemed like, based on experiences in other communities, there's more opportunities to protect for things to go wrong with coordination there. And similarly with some recent experiences with foredune grading plans that in other communities that also informed that policy in terms of the need for a little extra prompt in county policy for enhanced coordination. And then in terms of recommended actions on in addition to policies, OPRD has discussed potentially updating or amending the ocean shore management plan with some more specific reach or literal cell-based plans that would be more specific in guiding permit decisions in those places. And so if OPRD wants to do that in Clatsop County, it's just that the recommended action is that the county participate with them in doing it to make sure that it reflects local perspective as well. Okay, so Dogami, the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, has created new beach and dune geomorphology data that I just referenced. There's certain beach and dune environments where State Goal 18 basically says that commercial, residential, and industrial development is prohibited. And those correspond to a few new classifications that Dogami has made for their maps. And these classifications basically describe dune stability, presence of wetlands, and some other characteristics. But so they've provided the county with their draft data, and it's not practical to like review the details in a PDF map or PowerPoint presentation view, but essentially the result is that there's going to be much more fine-grained characterization of beach and dune stability available going forward than there has been in the past to inform permit decisions. And so they've gone all the way, it goes all the way from Clatsop Spit down through Arch Cape. And again, it's draft data. That this is the one data set that I think is not available online right now. But Dogami is going to make it available in early 2025, they've said. All right, so with that being said, that's the end of the presentation, and those are sort of the highlights or major areas of policy changes that we're going to be recommending. And I apologize if I missed any raised hands or anything in the chat here, but does anyone have anything that they'd like to ask about, or any thoughts on what we went over? Cameron?
Yeah, I just, excuse me, thank you for that presentation. I just have one question. Is the county going to consider a policy on cable landings of grouping or clumping cable landings in particular areas so you don't get, as you have in some other counties, a cable here and a cable there, and someone wants to do one in another place, but rather to minimize the amount of damage to the beach and to potentially to the shore as well, to have a designated, I don't know the technical term, a designated incoming place where they all have to cluster at one landing place rather than being able to land wherever they want.
Yeah, we weren't headed towards doing that. We are trying to just evaluate sort of our own draft policy on prohibition areas to see a bit more about where that would lead potential cable landings to go. And it sounds like, I mean, to some extent, it's like when a cable landing is permitted, there will already be some natural tendency for other cable to be attracted to that site, is my understanding from like industry documents and other reports we read. But yeah, I understand why there could be a preference for that. Like, and maybe it would be just a simple statement to be made that using an existing site is preferred to developing a new site.
Is
So that's
something, I just think that some mandatory or at least semi-mandatory requirement that the initial alternative, place a burden of proof on the applicant to show why they would not enter into an already designated landing site. There would have to be a good reason to not do that, because otherwise you just have some companies, as happened with Facebook in Tillamook County, but other ones as well, often want to have their own landing site where they can completely control the situation and they aren't interfering with or being interfered by other cables. And so in order to direct parties more towards a particular site, I think there needs to be some mandatory or prefatory mandatory language in the ordinance.
okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that comment, Cameron. I think that's a good idea. And Garrett, there's precedence for, if you look at like cell towers, cell sites for wireless telecommunications facilities, you can require them to, have a statement of why they need to do tower versus co-locating on an existing tower.
Right.
And that could work probably exactly the same for a cable landing site.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. My worry is, pushing a cable under the beach has repercussions on the beach. Sinkholes are an obvious one, but even if there isn't a sinkhole, then the beach is no longer a natural beach. It may look natural on the surface, but it really has already been industrialized at some level. And I think that it should, given the state's highly protective statutory framework for the beaches in the first place, and the stresses that beaches are going to be undergoing as climate change accelerates, is that minimizing the industrialization of the beach by cables is something that the county might really want to take in hand.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I can see the policy for encouraging reusing existing sites and facilities. And it leads to me wondering, well, is there something about permitting the first one where there's policy that somehow encourages that it's designed to accommodate additional capacity? And I think that's something we'd have to learn more about, all the different considerations before going down that road as well. But thanks, Cameron.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I had a question that had come up from our meeting on Saturday, and I didn't bring it up to you, but maybe we can talk about it now and see if anybody has a thought. We were starting to toss out an idea about beaches and dunes vegetation management, and if vegetation is to be removed for some permitted use, how would revegetation take place in terms of should it be replacement of species removed, or should it have a preference to native vegetation versus non-native vegetation? And who would keep a list of the preferred species?
Yeah, so right now, there's no specific guidance on like the particular methods for or timelines for revegetating or the species that are preferred or not preferred. So that could come indirectly through like the applicant's project description and attempting to meet standards like not causing impacts on neighboring properties or not destabilizing the dunes. But it's up to applicants to meet sort of that relatively subjective standard. And so I think there could be a place for, specifying at least some characteristics without, we want to provide flexibility for like each unique site situation and project goals. There might be times when, using one grass species is preferable to using another, and then it's different in a different situation. But I'm not sure, at least maybe providing like all those options so that at least one of them is used. Gail?
Yeah, so one thing to also factor into that, Garrett, is that while we want to be flexible, we also have to be very cognizant of the state's requirements about clear and objective standards especially when it comes to housing. So if we're going to be impacting housing development, I don't know how much housing development we'll see along the coast, right on the ocean, but that's something that we just need to keep in the back of our heads as well.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and maybe the low hanging fruit is, rather than talking about native versus non-native, you just say non-invasive species for revegetation purposes. And that's pretty clear. And I know the Oregon State University keeps a list of species that are considered invasive.
Okay, we'll look at it. I know that in some, I mean, you guys can, interpret that in a sensible way. Some people could interpret that like European beach grass is invasive, and it is, right? It's invasive. So, but it provides stability, and it provides a certain kind of stability and a certain kind of dune growth versus American beach grass, which grows dunes a little bit differently. And in some cases, you might want one versus the other. You might want and European beach grass, I think, is a bit more aggressive. Sometimes you want that for sort of rapid stability, but we'll take a look at that. And Andrea and I, because Andrea has even more experience, are gonna kind of look at how we can be a bit more specific with making sure that revegetation occurs appropriately. Does anyone know, like, I mean, Cameron, you've been involved in some other county processes. Does anything come to mind in terms of other places that have done a good job of specifying how revegetation should occur after disturbances?
Well, generally, when I've worked on situations like this, the local ordinances specify a preference for native species.
Yeah.
They grow best, they know the environment. The trouble or the potential conflict that comes up apparently is that applicants may say, well, but the native species don't do what we want them to do. European beach grass, for example, stabilizes the dunes. Well, that's what we want, but it's not a native species, and there aren't native species that have the same dune stabilizing effects at such a rapid pace as European beach grass does. So you get that kind of conflict, and it really has to be a policy choice by the jurisdiction that the most important thing we're trying to do here is to keep a preference for native species. I'm a little concerned about statements about non-invasive species, which is on the theory that not all imported species are invasive. But that isn't always so obvious at a given point. Species don't land on our shores and become invasive the next minute. This can take a long time. It can also change as climate changes or as other aspects of the environment change. A species that was not invasive becomes invasive. So I think that's a really slippery category. And my best experiences have always been with jurisdictions that manifest a strong preference for native species in every situation, unless there's a strong need to do otherwise. European beach grass is probably the best example because it was imported to stabilize dunes. That's what it was brought for. That's what it has done. Nobody can give it a bad report card for doing what it was brought to do. It did a really great job. So then the question is, where do we really need to stabilize the dunes? That's where we should be putting European beach grass if that's where we want to use it. But it should not be in the state parks and on people's farms and other places where we don't need to stabilize the dunes. And so having standards in the ordinance for what species should be used for where if they're non-native species, I think is really important. And those can be written with the help of coastal biologists to be pretty crisp.
All right, thank you. It is 7:30. I don't have to go anywhere, so does anyone have anything else they'd like to talk about? All right. Well, we have a technical advisory committee meeting Friday morning at 10 a.m. and the link is on the county's webpage. And anyone is welcome to attend. Thank you for coming this evening. Hope you found it informative. And thanks for weighing in. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Garrett. Yeah, thanks everybody for
Thank you,
coming.
Garrett.
Thank
In
you.
case there's folks who have not received an email from me before or are not familiar with the county's website, I'm going to post my email in the chat. I just did it, and I'll post a link real quick to the website where we keep up to date on the update process. Again, thanks everybody for joining, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye, everyone. Thanks, Andrea.
Yeah. Sorry, I tripped over my words so much.
That's okay.
I don't know what's going on.
There were the words on screen too, so it wasn't,
You trip over
Yeah.
your words and I fill all the dead space with ums and ahs. So we both have more growth ahead of us.
Yes, definitely.
Presenting.
I always have room for improvement.
All right.
All right.
Oh, I better stop this
Guys.
recording. Shoot.